She needs to stand, Mr. Breyer. The community guidelines are clear. That was Varela Curnow, president of the Cresthaven Vale HOA, smiling as she nodded toward my daughter's assistive frame like it was some kind of trash bin on our porch. Her clipboard slapped against her leg with smug rhythm, just loud enough to punctuate the threat. If it's not removed by Friday, we'll begin enforcement proceedings. Daily fines, loss of amenity access, you know the drill. I didn't flinch. The drill is illegal, and the brass post you're pointing at was installed under certified ADA override. It's logged with the county, time-stamped, and backed by state housing code. Her eyes flickered, but just for a moment. If you're a parent or someone who's had to fight for a loved one's dignity, subscribe now. You're going to want to hear how this one ends. My name is Calum Breyer. I'm a federally licensed human factors ergonomist. I work on courtroom infrastructure, adaptive access, and public safety designs. For 10 years, I've helped cities avoid lawsuits like the one you're walking straight into. And that post? I pointed to the curved brass hook bolted beside our ramp. My wife, who passed 2 years ago, installed that for our daughter before she could even speak. I built that porch with her. I remember how her hands trembled when she engraved the initials into the metal, CB for Sarah Breyer. She died before EVN ever stood upright. That hook was her gift, a way for EVN to transfer from wheelchair to standing frame with her own strength, without needing to call for help. She practiced every morning at sunrise, hand over hand, gritting through pain I can't imagine, just to rise. Not for show, for freedom. Varela knew all of this, but 2 days ago, she issued a visual violation citation, claiming the post and standing frame weren't in harmony with neighborhood design guidelines. This morning, she showed up in person, not with sympathy, with enforcement. The part that tore something out of me, she smiled while saying it. Varela Curnow, president of our HOA board, had the tone of someone rearranging a flower pot, not threatening to erase the one thing giving my daughter the will to keep trying. She gestured to the printout again. Look, we can work something out. Maybe a removable unit, something less visible from the sidewalk. The sidewalk no one uses, the sidewalk 20 feet downhill. Do you have kids? I asked, even though I already knew the answer. She didn't respond. I stepped forward and angled the hook toward her. This isn't a structure, it's a spine, for a girl who doesn't have one that works. Her lips thinned. We'll proceed with fines. She turned and walked back to her white electric sedan, parked half a foot over our curb like some soft-spoken warning. I waited until she drove off before turning to Evienne, who had wheeled herself quietly into the doorway behind me. Her eyes flicked toward the brass hook, then away. She's wrong, I said gently. She's going to lose. Evienne didn't speak. She just placed her hand on the railing, then pulled it back. Not because she couldn't reach, because the fear had already arrived. And that's when I realized what this was. Not a citation, not a misunderstanding. This was removal, erasure, not just of equipment, but of identity. Cresthaven Vale didn't want to see disability. They wanted it hidden, compliant, quiet. They didn't know who I was. I wasn't just a grieving father. I was an auditor for half the courthouses in the state. I taught seminars on ADA building codes. I'd testified in 3 trials. And now they were making my daughter stand for them just to keep living here? That was the moment I made the call, not to a lawyer, to the Office of Civil Rights. The court date was already scheduled, but none of them, not Varela, not the board, not the smirking neighbor who'd filed the anonymous complaint, knew what was coming. I wasn't removing the hook. I was about to pull the entire board off its hinges. The neighborhood pavilion always smelled like cedar planks and overwatered plants. It was meant to be a place for serenity, curated calm, but today it was surveillance wrapped in smiles, folding chairs lined up in uneven rows, name tags on paper cups, and Varela Curnow standing beneath a Community Unity brunch banner, like she hadn't just threatened a disabled child's independence 2 days earlier. She was shaking hands with new residents, laughing softly, performing benevolence for the people who hadn't lived here long enough to know what she really was. I stood in the back with Evienne, her wheelchair half in shadow. She didn't want to come, but this was mandatory attendance for all amenity access households, which included us. Another coercive clause buried in HOA policy language. Varela made eye contact across the lawn. Didn't flinch, didn't smile. She'd already filed 2 more notices against us since our last conversation. One about unauthorized mobility fixtures, and another accusing me of unsanctioned construction activities, meaning the minor ramp modification I made to Evianne's access step. A ramp that had saved her from falling just last week. We weren't alone, though. I noticed something I hadn't before. A mother of twins across the path avoided eye contact and shifted her chair closer to her children. Mr. Hessel, the elderly man with the oxygen tank, glanced at our direction and then away quickly, as if looking at us too long might get him sighted. I saw it then, the pressure they were all under. None of them had ramps or visible medical equipment anymore. I'd seen Hessel's portable stair rail once, months ago. It was gone. This wasn't about our hook. It wasn't even about rules. This was curated control. The pattern was quiet, nearly. Invisible if you weren't watching. Minor citations stacked over time. Parking reminders. Lawn discoloration complaints. Then the polite suggestion, maybe you'd be happier in a neighborhood more tailored to your lifestyle. It was displacement via inconvenience. The brunch continued. Varela took center space beneath the banner. I just want to take a moment to thank everyone who's helping keep Cresthaven Vale one of the cleanest, most harmonious communities in the state, she said. Our visual unity policy has been such a success thanks to your commitment. Applause rippled across the lawn. Not enthusiasm, compliance. And a reminder, fixtures and personal devices visible from the street need to be screened or relocated within 30 days. We're offering resources to help ease this transition. My jaw clenched. Devices. That's what my daughter's frame was. A visual problem to be screened. She wasn't done. And as a gesture of good faith, we're launching the Harmony Assistance Fund, small grants to help residents remove non-conforming structures. She smiled directly at me. No one else seemed to notice. That's when Thorian Pell appeared. He lingered at the side table, adjusting a stack of laminated rule sheets. He was the board's records officer, a quiet man, tall, slightly hunched, always carrying more than he said. But something in his face had changed. His eyes flicked toward Varela, then toward me, just once. Then he turned and walked into the HOA office behind the pavilion without touching the coffee he'd poured. Later, when I passed the front desk, I saw a page from the HOA welcome packet half torn in the recycling bin. The original version, no mention of the visual unity clause, so it wasn't in the documents when we moved in. I pressed my hand lightly against Evianne's shoulder as I wheeled her toward the exit path. Her expression was unreadable. They didn't mention the grants in the emails, she said quietly. No, I replied. They only show you the gifts when you've already given up. We left before the raffle started. I didn't need a door prize. I needed a wall to knock down. And now I could see the pattern clearly. Selective enforcement, edited records, pressure disguised as policy. Varela had built a system designed to look cooperative but function as coercion, and everyone else was too afraid or too exhausted to push back. But I wasn't everyone else. I was documenting everything, watching the changes, capturing timestamps. And I knew where this type of policy enforcement failed, in court. Varela thought she was safe behind community bylaws and polite language. She hadn't realized yet that those protections only worked if no one challenged their foundation. And I had just started digging. Thorian Pell always moved like someone trying not to be noticed. He walked softly, shoulders slightly rounded, clipboard held too tightly. You'd mistake him for another quiet cog in the machine if you weren't paying attention. Most people didn't. That's why Varela liked him. But I'd been watching. It was the way he double-checked timestamps on notices before dropping them off. The way he hesitated just half a second longer before handing over citations related to disability access. And most telling of all, the way he avoided looking at my daughter. On Tuesday morning, I intercepted him on the path behind our unit. He was carrying 3 envelopes and a wrinkled maintenance checklist. His eyes flicked up and froze when he saw me standing there, not moving. "Morning," he said. His voice was thin, cautious. I didn't answer. Just looked at the envelopes. One had our address. He followed my gaze and held it out, but didn't meet my eyes. "This one's about the porch light, I think. Voltage regulation rule," he muttered. Thorian, I said, slow and even. When's the last time a porch light regulation was enforced here? He opened his mouth, then closed it. They're stacking paper trails, I said. So when the lawsuit comes, they can say I was non-compliant across the board. Still, he said nothing. I lowered my voice. My daughter is being harassed, a child, in a wheelchair. If you keep delivering these notices, you're not neutral. You're enabling it. Something cracked in his face. Not rage, not fear, shame. I don't write them, he said. I just log and deliver. But you know, I said. You know what's going on. He blinked a few times, fast. It's not just you. There've been others. That stopped me. He hadn't meant to say it, I could tell. Who? He shook his head. Can't talk about residents. I've already said too much. He started to walk around me, but I stepped aside without blocking him. I didn't need to trap him. He was already cornered by his conscience. Later that night, I dug deeper. Online. Forums for disability rights had a few anonymous threads mentioning Cresthaven Vale, vague posts, stories about sudden HOA hostility after mobility changes, medical installations, ramps being denied retroactively. Nothing definitive, but the patterns were disturbingly similar. Then I found it. A 5-year-old archive post on a municipal accessibility forum. A woman named Sylvie had filed a failed complaint about visual uniformity policies being used to push her husband, who used a scooter, off their property in an HOA near Ridgepoint Heights. The HOA name, Cresthaven Vale. I scrolled further and saw a familiar phrase. Visual unity guidelines enforced against visible medical fixtures. The same phrase from Varella's brunch announcement. This wasn't new. This was policy, buried, quiet, and weaponized. The next day I watched Thorian from across the street as he carried boxes from the HOA office to his car. His movements were tight, careful, but every few seconds he paused and scanned the sidewalk like someone expecting to be watched. I wasn't the only one noticing now. When he turned and caught me looking, he didn't flinch. He nodded. It wasn't an apology. It was something else. A beginning. That night, I took EVN to the porch. She gripped the brass hook again, knuckles pale. She was trying to rise, just for a second, but I could see the hesitation in her wrist. I don't want them to see me, she whispered. They don't get to own what you do out here, I said. This space is ours, every inch, and they'll have to fight the law to change that. She didn't try again, but she didn't roll away either. She stayed, and I stayed with her, watching the sky go dark behind the ridgelines. Inside, my case folder was growing. Thorian had confirmed more than he realized. He'd planted a crack in their foundation, and I knew exactly how to widen it. The next escalation didn't come through a letter. It came through a lock. I returned home from work Wednesday evening to find the community fitness center keypad rejecting my access code. I tried again, slower, same response. The screen flashed red, followed by a message in small gray text. Access suspended. Contact HOA for resolution. I stood there, gripping my bag, staring at the keypad like it might change its mind. Inside the gym were EVN's parallel bars, donated by my late wife, installed with board approval and used 3 times a week as part of EVN's motor reconditioning. She loved the bars. They gave her a sense of play, even while her legs struggled to obey. More than once I'd found her humming to herself as she balanced between them, eyes locked ahead. They were hers now. And this was Varela cutting her off. I didn't go home. I walked straight to the HOA office, 2 blocks uphill. The lights were on. Varela's car, polished to a gleam, sat parked perfectly centered in the designated board member spot. I didn't knock when I entered. She looked up from her desk like she'd been expecting me. There's a process, Mr. Breyer. Access was paused due to unresolved compliance citations. I kept my voice low. What citations relate to a child's rehab access? She tapped a folder. 3 non-compliant fixtures, 2 unresolved notices, and 1 pending review. You know this is a retaliatory act. Her expression didn't change. We follow policy. You've chosen not to engage through the proper channels. And unfortunately, when access depends on active standing with the association, I cut her off. We're not a library membership. We're homeowners. You're denying medical access to a child. She lifted her pen. We're maintaining standards. That word again. Standards. It sounded sterile, precise. But in her mouth, it was a blade, a tool for pruning people like us from the image she wanted this place to present. Reinstate access, I said, or I. Report you for ADA interference. She tapped the desk. I consulted our legal liaison. The HOA is not a federally funded entity. ADA claims don't apply in the same manner. She was technically right and profoundly wrong. Because she was counting on that distinction, the gap between what's legally required and what's morally right, to protect her. But there were other mechanisms. Civil rights compliance reviews, local building codes, state-level housing accessibility enforcement. This wasn't the first time I'd seen bureaucrats try to sidestep ADA obligations by leaning on technicalities, but it might be the last time she got away with it. I turned and left without another word. Outside, the air had grown colder. The mountains cast long shadows across the cobbled street. I texted Thorian one word. Confirmed. He replied an hour later with a short message. She had the code changed this morning, said it was an unauthorized user lockout. I didn't sign. Off. That was enough. Proof of intent, proof of action, proof of internal dissent. I added it to the file. The next morning, I took EVN to her old physical therapy center across town. The drive was longer, the facility louder, but when she stepped into the frame and pushed forward on trembling arms, I saw the same glimmer in her eyes. She didn't ask about the gym. Didn't need to. She knew. And I knew this wasn't just about hooks or ramps anymore. Varela was testing how far she could go, how much discomfort she could impose before a family like mine would leave. She wasn't saying no outright. She was layering pressure until our life became unsustainable. But we weren't moving. Not yet. That night, I began drafting the formal complaint, not just a letter. A structured submission to the Office of Civil Rights, Section 504 Complaint Division, and a duplicate package to the State Department of Accessibility Review. I included policy screenshots, photos of the hook, the denied access message, Thorian's message, even excerpts from the HOA's own violation codes, contrasted against their prior welcome packet. The strategy was forming. Varela thought this was a chessboard, but I'd stopped playing games. Now I was preparing a demolition plan. I didn't expect the breakthrough to come from a file I hadn't opened in years. The morning after the lockout, I sat cross-legged on the floor of my office, going through the archived materials Sarah had kept from the early days of designing our home. She was meticulous, always had been. Every measurement, every approval, every variance request logged and backed up. I wasn't looking for legal ammunition yet. I was just missing her, trying to feel her hand in the details again. And then I saw it. A labeled folder, ADA variance approvals, Breyer Lot, CVH 147. Inside was a printed email chain from 5 years ago. Attached to it, an official stamped letter from the county planning office signed by a compliance officer. It confirmed that our property, due to EVN's mobility limitations, had been granted an ADA construction exemption clause under the county's accessibility inclusion program. The brass support hook, the side ramp, the lower porch slope, they weren't just modifications. They were certified pre-build accommodations, logged, registered, on record, which meant the HOA not only lacked the authority to demand their removal, they were in violation for trying. I ran my thumb across the county seal like it was sacred. My hands trembled, but not with emotion, with purpose. This was more than leverage. This was a structural checkmate. Sarah had seen it all coming, or at least prepared for every possibility. I scanned the documents, watermarked them, and uploaded them into a protected cloud folder, backing them up 3 ways. I sent a copy to my own legal contact at the State Commission for Housing Compliance, someone I'd worked with during a municipal audit, 2 years back. Then I picked up the phone. "Amari," I said when she answered. "You remember Cresthaven Vale?" A pause. "The one with the curved sidewalks and fake bird sounds?" "Yeah, I remember. They're trying to remove a federally approved accessibility fixture. I have stamped documents from pre-construction. HOAs fining us and locking out rehab spaces. You want me to look into filing Escalation? I want to know if the county will open an internal compliance review without me naming my daughter." There was a long pause on the other end. Then, "Yes, if you send me the ADA clause documentation and proof of attempt to interfere, I can flag it internally. I'll send it in 10. It was the first time in weeks I exhaled without feeling like something would collapse beneath me. I leaned back in the chair and looked at the original hard copy again. I remembered the day we got it. Sierra had placed it in a protective sleeve and said, "One day, someone's going to try and take this from us, and when they do, you hand them this and say, 'Good luck.'" Varela didn't know it yet, but she'd just picked the wrong target. I wasn't working from hope anymore. I had legal fact. The rest of the day moved slowly. I reviewed the HOA bylaws again, this time with sharper eyes. I noted every line that could be interpreted as discriminatory under state housing equity law, any language implying selective visibility enforcement. I added those into my growing file. When Thorian passed by my property late afternoon, I was waiting on the steps. I didn't speak. I just held up a single sheet, the stamped ADA approval, and watched his expression shift. He nodded, barely, before continuing on. But I knew he understood. Proof changed everything. Inside, Evienne sat in her chair, sketching designs for a new transfer handle she wanted to try. She didn't know yet that the fixture she depended on was now legally armored. I'd tell her soon. For now, I wanted her to feel normal again, to design, to dream, without needing to fight for every inch of it. The walls were closing in on Varela, and I hadn't even started pressing yet. I should have seen it coming. The moment someone like Varela gets cornered, she doesn't back down. She sharpens her tactics. 2 days after I filed the ADA exemption evidence, a new letter appeared taped, not mailed, taped to our front door. No envelope, no signature. Just a single sheet with an HOA watermark and the words, "Notice of Conditional Covenant Review Pending." I read it twice. It wasn't a violation notice. It was something more insidious. A warning of community rights to reassess conditional allowances if material property conditions change. She was going after the foundation of our approval itself, trying to argue that EVN's mobility status or the scope of the modifications had materially changed and should therefore be reevaluated. The language was vague on purpose. It wasn't meant to hold up in court. It was meant to rattle me. It didn't work, but it did something worse. It rattled Evienne. She found the notice before I got home. When I walked into the house, she was already in her room, quiet, too quiet, the kind where silence fills the whole hallway like fog. I knocked once, then opened the door. She sat beside the standing frame, her legs crossed awkwardly, like she was trying to force comfort into a position her muscles didn't want. Her fingers picked at the corner of her sketchbook. "They're going to take it, aren't they?" she asked. I sat down beside her. "No, they're trying to scare us because we're standing in the way." She didn't answer, just stared at the frame. I leaned forward. "You're not being removed, and that hook isn't going anywhere." She turned her head slightly. "It's not about the hook." I waited. She looked at me, eyes dark and steady. "It's about me. They don't want me here." That landed harder than anything Varela had done, because she was right. This wasn't about structures or frames or visual guidelines. This was about what my daughter represented to people like Varela. A deviation from the aesthetic fantasy they sold on glossy HOA brochures. They wanted flowers, matching trim, children running in straight lines. Evienne didn't fit, and they were trying to make her feel it. I pulled the sketchbook gently from her hands and set it down. "You know what I do for a living, right?" "You build ramps," she said with a shrug. "Not just ramps," I said. "I design public buildings so people like you can be seen, move freely, and not have to ask for permission. Courtrooms, government offices, schools. I've spent most of my life fighting quiet architecture that says, 'You're not welcome.'" She looked away. "I didn't just fight for you once, Evienne. I fight for you every time someone like Varela pretends to be in charge of dignity." Her chin dipped slightly. Just enough. We sat like that for a while. By nightfall, the silence between us had softened. I knew she was holding herself together by threads, but she was still holding. And sometimes that was enough. Later that evening, I got a call from Amari. "The county logged your exemption. They pulled the original approval files. You're clean." "And the covenant review she's threatening?" "Meaningless. HOA boards don't have the power to reclassify ADA exemptions unless the owner themselves requests it, or unless fraud is proven, which won't happen." "She's pushing anyway." "Then let her. Just make sure she signs the next one." That gave me an idea. The next morning I went to the HOA office. Varela wasn't there, but Thorian was. He looked up as I walked in, eyes tight, jaw tense. "She's drafting a board vote," he said quietly. "Trying to pass a revision on conditional fixture. Reviews." "She trying to hide her involvement?" He nodded. "She's pushing it through as a board suggestion, not personal action. No direct trail. Can you get me a timestamp on when the draft was created? If it postdates my exemption submission, it's retaliation." He hesitated. "I'm not asking you to leak anything," I said. "Just tell me whether she crossed the line." He sighed. "She's already across it." He didn't say more. He didn't have to. Varela was trying to rewrite rules mid-conflict, but she'd already stepped into territory she couldn't walk back from. I didn't need to escalate anymore. I just needed to document every step she took from here on out. Because retaliation, when proven, isn't just unethical, it's federally actionable. Thorian didn't show up at the next board meeting. That alone said more than anything he could have put in writing. For 3 years, he'd never missed one. Always sat second from the left. Note, tablet in hand, careful not to speak unless asked. But that night, his seat stayed empty. Varela ran the meeting with forced calm. She introduced the new policy draft. Resolution 11B, clarification of non-standard visual fixtures and conditional installation reviews. The title sounded like wallpaper. Beneath it, the language was surgical. If passed, it would give the board authority to retroactively reassess any architectural or mechanical additions in conflict with evolving community standards. It was a smokescreen for retribution, and she wasn't subtle about it. "Our aim," she said, smiling toward the crowd of a dozen tired homeowners, "is to ensure harmony, clarity, and fairness across the entire community. This policy simply provides transparency and tools for maintaining a balanced environment." I sat in the back, arms folded, file folder in my lap. I hadn't planned to speak. Then I saw her eyes land on EVN's empty seat beside me. Calculated. I stood. "I'd like to speak before the vote." Varela's smile flickered. "This isn't a hearing, Mr. Breyer." "No, but you're about to vote on a resolution that may materially affect my daughter's legal rights, and I have evidence it's retaliatory." The room stilled. No one moved. A few board members glanced at each other, unsure. She hesitated, then gestured stiffly. 3 minutes. I walked to the front and placed a printed timeline on the table in front of the board. Every date, every notice, every instance of contact between my family and the HOA since the exemption documents were submitted. Then I placed the original stamped ADA exemption beside it. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. "This isn't about harmony," I said. "This is about punishment, and you all know it." One board member, a man named Lexon, looked at the papers and then at Varela. "Is this the same fixture from the Breyer exemption file?" Varela didn't answer. I continued. "You don't need to like the fixture. You don't need to like that my daughter uses a standing frame, but you do have a legal responsibility not to interfere with it." Murmurs behind me. One neighbor nodded slightly, another frowned at the documents. Varela cut in. "The resolution is general. It doesn't mention any resident by name." I turned slowly. "But it was drafted days after I submitted legal documents protecting my daughter's equipment. It was never general. It was personal. You just dressed it in policy." And then the door opened. Thorian walked in. No clipboard, no uniform, just a man in a wrinkled shirt who looked like he hadn't slept. He didn't sit. He walked straight to the front table, pulled a flash drive from his pocket, and placed it beside the resolution printout. "I have the revision metadata," he said. "Creation date, edit logs, and internal emails related to Resolution 11B. The first draft was written 2 hours after Mr. Breyer's exemption file was logged." The silence broke like glass. Varela stood, eyes wide. "This is out of order." "No," Thorian said, voice flat. "What's out of order is using board authority to harass a child. I won't be part of it." He turned and walked out, left the room in full silence. The vote never happened. The meeting adjourned early, under the pretense of needing legal review. But the damage was already done. I didn't speak to Thorian that night. I let him go. He'd done more than I could have asked. He hadn't just cracked the wall. He'd given me the wrecking ball. That flash drive would go into the formal complaint. along with the timeline, along with the voice recordings of the board's delay tactics, along with every fine, every closure, every rewritten policy since this started. Varela had tried to erase us with procedural ink. Now we had fire, and she was running out of places to hide. I spent the next 3 days building a submission, packet so tight it could snap bone. It wasn't just about the ADA exemption anymore, not just the standing frame, the hook, the lockout, or the stacked violations. It was about pattern, proof of retaliation, demonstrated abuse of HOA authority targeting a protected class, in this case, a disabled minor. And thanks to Thorian's flash drive, I now had timeline alignment down to the hour. The key was precision. The Office of Civil Rights didn't respond to anger, they responded to evidence. I built a case file that mapped every notice, access denial, and policy draft against the moment I submitted EVN's exemption. Not just cause and effect, but malicious sequence. The email logs Thorian provided showed Varela consulting with one of the board's outside advisors an hour after my documentation landed in their inbox. The advisor's reply, one line, initiate revision authority before it locks. They knew what they were doing. They were trying to override our legal protections before the system could register them as binding. That's the kind of thing that gets federal attention. I started labeling each attachment with subcodes, Exhibit A through H, each with metadata timestamps, photographs, voice recordings from meetings, board sessions where language like preserving visual order and preemptive compatibility was used instead of what they really meant, purge. Amari called that Friday morning. County Housing Compliance Board is quietly reviewing your submission, she said. They won't tell you yet, but I can confirm there's an internal memo going around. Will they investigate publicly? If they find a second or third incident that echoes yours, yes. Otherwise, it stays internal. That was my green light. I created a secondary version of the file for the Department of Justice's Disability Rights section. Federal, the big guns. Not because I expected them to launch a case, but because a federal shadow, hanging over a local HOA, does something unique. It terrifies insurance carriers. And fear is leverage. I scheduled a consultation with an independent fair housing specialist, someone I knew from my municipal projects. We spoke for an hour. I laid out everything. When I finished, he was silent for a beat. You've got her, he said finally. This isn't an overreach. It's systemic exclusion dressed as neighborhood decorum. Will the feds act? If they don't, your state office will. This is strong, ironclad. Then he added something else. If she's smart, she'll step down before this goes public. But something tells me she's not smart. I already knew she wasn't. While I built my federal file, I launched a second track, something softer, but just as surgical. I sent a certified letter to the HOA insurance underwriter listed in the community's fiscal disclosures. I wasn't making a claim. I was notifying them of a pending discrimination, investigation against their client. They'd read the words child, ADA, and federal complaint. That's all it would take. If they dropped coverage or even issued a warning, Varela would be left exposed, financially and legally. Her personal assets might suddenly matter more than her board title. I wasn't seeking money, I was seeking pressure. Meanwhile, I added a motion-activated camera to the porch, focused not on the walkway, but on the hook, on EVN's frame. Not because I expected sabotage, but because I expected desperation. That weekend, I watched her through the window, EVN alone on the porch. She reached for the brass post, grabbed it, not to use it, but to clean it. She wiped it gently with a cloth, like it was something sacred. I hadn't asked her to, but she knew. She knew it wasn't just steel, it was a stand. Later that night, I finalized the submission and dropped both packets at the courier's desk. State, federal, time-stamped, filed. By morning, I had delivery confirmation. The countdown had started. And the moment either of those offices opened their response, Varela would no longer be fighting me. She'd be fighting a statute. The email came through at 9:47 a.m., buried in a stack of work notifications. Subject line, Acknowledgement of Preliminary Review, OCR File 63827D. Just a single paragraph, clinical in tone, confirming receipt, and preliminary acceptance of my submission for evaluation. It was the first step in a long process. But it was real. They were watching now. I forwarded the email to Amari and to the housing specialist I'd consulted with. Then I printed 2 copies, clipped them neatly, and slipped them into my folder labeled External Oversight. My desk had become a control panel, multiple tabs open across 2 screens, folders sorted by agency, correspondence time-stamped to the minute. Every piece of this case had to live in a structure that could withstand scrutiny. No gaps, no emotion in the files, just proof. But strategy doesn't win alone. It needs positioning. That afternoon, I made rounds in the neighborhood. First stop, the corner unit with ivy-covered rails where an elderly couple lived, the Channings. I'd seen them use a walker ramp that disappeared about a month after we moved in. I knocked gently. Mr. Channing answered, cautious but polite. "I'm not asking you to testify," I said. "But if the state opens a full review, they'll ask if this has happened to others. Your story might matter more than you think." He didn't respond, but he didn't close the door either. Next, I stopped by the unit with the blue shutters, Nora Ellen's house. Her son had used a therapy dog. I remembered the dog going missing from community events, then the removal of their temporary fence. I hadn't seen her speak at a board meeting in over a year. She opened the door, saw the envelope in my hand, and immediately tensed. "It's not a lawsuit," I said. "It's protection. You're not alone." Her expression softened just a notch. By evening, 5 households had agreed to review the summary page I'd prepared. Not all were ready to go on record, but 3 asked for copies of the OCR complaint number. They wanted to watch the situation. That was fine by me. Visibility was a step. I returned home just as the sun dipped behind the ridge. Evienne was on the porch again, sketchbook balanced across her lap, the brass hook casting a thin shadow across her drawing. She looked up as I walked by, expression unreadable. "They were whispering at school," she said, "about the notice you filed." I paused. "What were they saying?" "That I'm going to be famous." I smiled faintly. "Not the worst thing." She looked back at her sketch. "Is it going to work?" I sat down beside her. "It's already working, just slowly." "I don't want to be their lesson." "You're not. You're the reason the lesson exists." She let that sit for a while, then nodded once. I didn't know what she was drawing, but she was focused. Focused enough that her hand trembled slightly from the strain of holding position. She'd do that when she was determined to finish something, without asking for help. Inside, my phone buzzed. It was a voicemail from Thorian, short, tense. "She's calling an emergency meeting. No agenda listed. Internal only. I'll try to get a copy if they record it. Be careful. She's cornered." That told me more than anything else. Varela wasn't waiting. She was planning. I checked the HOA portal an hour later. Sure enough, there was a newly listed closed board session scheduled for the following evening. No public comment. No minutes promised. It meant one thing. They were preparing for defense, or worse, counterattack. I wasn't worried, because every move they made now could be framed as reactionary. And I had the receipts to prove it. I backed up Thorian's voicemail to a private cloud folder. Then I made 2 more copies of my submission packet, added the updated email from OCR, and set them aside, one for the local press if it came to that. Varela could draft as many internal policies as she wanted, but the moment she acted on them, they'd become evidence. And I had just finished setting the trap. The emergency meeting didn't start with a bang. It started with silence. I wasn't allowed inside, none of us were, but I parked across the street from the HOA office anyway, engine off, windows cracked. From where I sat, I could see the board members filter in one by one. Clipboard, laptop, legal pads, no smiles, no chatter. Varela arrived last. She stepped out of her car wearing slate gray instead of her usual cream tone blazer. It wasn't a wardrobe change. It was a shift in posture. She was no longer playing benevolent gatekeeper. She was on defense. I didn't need audio to know what was happening inside. I knew her type. I'd worked with enough executives and officials to recognize the strategy. Silence opposition, create alternate paperwork, build a narrative before someone else does. But she was too late. At 6:13 p.m., my email pinged. Subject line, record attached, CVHOA closed board, session 10.726, internal. No message, no sender signature. The file came from an unmarked address, but I recognized the naming convention. It matched Thorian's previous internal logs. I didn't open it in the car. I waited, watched the meeting drag on through dusk, watched the lights stay on long after normal business hours, watched Lexin leave first, his jaw clenched tight as he walked down the steps, like gravity weighed more than usual. When I finally walked through my door, I poured a glass of water, set it beside the keyboard, and pressed play. The audio began mid-sentence. "This level of escalation was not anticipated," said a voice. Sounded like one of the board members, female, probably Prisha. Corman. Then came Varela. "This is not a federal case. It's a neighborhood dispute. We're treating it like it's a Title II violation, and it isn't." Another board member. "Then why did you initiate the review after his exemption was submitted?" Silence. Then paper shuffling. Then, "Because it sets a precedent. If we allow one fixture, we'll be flooded with exceptions." That was it. I stopped the playback, rewound it. "If we allow one..." Those words weren't just petty. They were damning. No mention of EVN, no concern for a child's needs, just the fear of losing control. I clipped that section and saved it under 3 formats. I backed it up twice. This wasn't a story about a misunderstanding anymore. It was about governance used to erase what made a child different. And I wasn't done. The next morning, I filed an addendum to the OCR packet with a transcription of the audio. I labeled it Exhibit I, Intent to Retaliate Based on Precedent. Concerns. I time-stamped the quote, listed the speaker as HOA President, verified via roll context, and attached a sworn statement asserting the authenticity of the audio. No embellishment, no color, just facts. I sent a separate copy to the insurance carrier, not accusing, just alerting. Then I took the printed transcript and dropped it in a sealed envelope at the HOA office mailbox with a single sticky note on top. This is what they'll read before deciding if your policy remains active. By noon, the HOA website had gone dark for scheduled maintenance. That same afternoon, I got a call from Nora Ellen. She wanted to sign a letter of support. So did Mr. Channing. So did 2 others who hadn't spoken up before. It was subtle, quiet, but the tide had turned. Varela had bet everything on silence, shame, and procedural camouflage. She hadn't accounted for exposure. That evening, I stepped out onto the porch. EVN was already there, hands gripping the brass hook. She didn't pull herself up. She didn't need to. She just stood beside it, hand resting gently on the curve, like she knew what it meant. "They're talking again," she said. "Let them. They're not whispering anymore." I looked out across the street. A neighbor waved, another nodded. No more curtains drawn, no more eyes looking away. The storm hadn't broken yet, but everyone knew which way the wind was blowing, and this time, it wasn't in her direction. It was behind her. The public hearing was scheduled for 10 a.m. on a Wednesday, tucked inside the neutral beige walls of the county administrative building. The room was built to be sterile, no color, no warmth, just microphones, plastic chairs, and quiet judgment. But from the moment I walked in, it was anything but quiet. The room was already half full. Local housing advocates, a reporter from the regional paper, a staffer from the Department of Accessibility, seated near the front with a folder that looked far too thick to be passive. Behind me, I recognized at least 5 Cresthaven Vale residents, including Thorian. He sat 2 rows back, no clipboard this time, just a plain gray folder in his lap, and a silence that didn't feel like guilt anymore. And then Varela walked in. No smile, no pretense. Just a tightly wound suit and a look that betrayed the edges of panic she hadn't had the skill to hide. The official called the session to order at exactly 10:01. Today's proceeding concerns allegations of retaliatory action, accessibility obstruction, and procedural abuse within the Homeowners Association governance structure of Cresthaven Vale. They called me first. I didn't start with emotion. I didn't mention the hook or the ramp or the frame. I led with timelines, exhibits, certifications. I read, calmly and clearly, the email response from OCR confirming receipt of the complaint, the timestamps from Thorian's flash drive, the quote from the emergency board, session. Then I paused, and I held up a photograph. Evian's standing frame, gleaming in early morning light, her hand gripping the brass hook beside it. "This is not about a fixture," I said. "It's about the message sent to a disabled child who did everything right and was punished for being visible. There wasn't a sound in the room. I stepped down. Next was Varela. She opened with a prepared statement, carefully worded, repetitive. She used phrases like community standards and non-compliance framework as shields. She cited documents no longer part of HOA policy. She never mentioned my daughter, but she slipped. When asked directly whether she had reviewed the ADA exemption documentation prior to initiating the review, she hesitated. I was aware of it, she said. That was enough. You could feel the shift. The air changed. The board called for review of the timeline exhibits. Thorian was invited to clarify his role. He spoke clearly, without flourish. He confirmed that the exemption file had been logged before any new resolution had been discussed internally. Then they played the audio. Her voice filled the room. If we allow one fixture, we'll be flooded with exceptions. Someone behind me gasped, not loud, but loud enough. Varela tried to recover. That quote was taken out of context, but the official cut her off. You were the one speaking, yes? She nodded. Then the context is yours to own. The hearing wrapped after that. No formal decision, just a promise of review and a record entered into the county register. But the silence that followed wasn't neutral. It was a silence heavy with conclusion. As we walked into the hallway, Nora touched my shoulder. You didn't just speak for her, she said. You spoke for all of us. Outside, the sun hit the concrete with flat heat. Evienne waited with Thorian under the overhang. She looked small in the shadow, but steady. Her eyes locked. With mine, and I saw it there. Recognition. Not of what had been won, but of what had been proven. We were no longer the family trying to hold on. We were the reason the structure shook. A county compliance officer approached me quietly as we walked toward the car. We'll issue the summary next week, she said. Regardless of the board's response, your protections will be enforced. I nodded. She paused. You know this will ripple. I'm counting on it. She offered a rare smile. Then we drove home, quiet, windows cracked, breeze moving gently across her sketch pad in the back seat. The hook would stay. But more than that, so would the truth. The county's decision landed on a Monday morning, time-stamped 8:32 a.m., with a subject line so ordinary it felt almost surreal. Findings issued, Cresthaven Vale, HOA review. I opened it at the kitchen counter, the light barely touching the tile, the house still quiet except for the faint hum of Evienne's chair. As she rolled toward me, the letter was 3 pages long. The first 2 were procedural language, definitions, statutes, citations. But the third was where everything lived. The county found the HOA in violation of accessibility interference statutes. They determined that the attempted removal of the brass hook and standing frame constituted discriminatory obstruction. They cited the lockout of the fitness center as retaliatory, and they formally referred the matter to the State Housing Authority for corrective oversight and mandated training. Then came the line that ended the fight. The Breyer accessibility fixtures and accommodations are hereby affirmed as protected and must remain without modification or obstruction. It was over, legally, publicly, permanently. I printed the document and handed it to Evienne. She read each line twice, lips moving silently. When she reached the end, she touched the paper like it was something fragile. So they can't make me get rid of it, she said. No, I answered. They can't touch it, ever. Her shoulders dropped, not in defeat, but in release. Weeks of tension gone in an instant, like breath finally allowed to leave her body. An hour later, I walked to the community center. I didn't go inside. I just pinned a copy of the findings to the bulletin board next to the HOA announcements, right where Varela liked to post her cheery reminders about harmony and uniformity. The board meeting scheduled for that evening was canceled. No explanation. Just a one-line notice on the portal. Meeting postponed pending board restructuring considerations. I knew what that meant. They were negotiating her exit. By noon, word had spread. Residents whispered outside mailboxes. People who had avoided looking at me before suddenly offered nods, quiet acknowledgments, the kind you give someone who walked through fire and came out carrying something still glowing. When I stepped outside later, I found the Channings standing at the end of my driveway. We heard, Mr. Channing said. Good. He hesitated, then added, It was never just you. I nodded, and for the first time since this began, It didn't feel like a battlefield where I stood alone. It felt like a place finally exhaling. Back inside, Evienne was on the porch, the sunlight sitting warm on her hair. She reached for the brass hook, fingers curling around it, not to stand, not to practice, just to touch it, claim it, own the space that had tried to push her out. She looked at me. "Can I paint it? Anything you want." She smiled, small but real, and began sketching ideas on her pad. Swirls, colors, initials, her mother's initials, her own. Late that afternoon, my phone buzzed with a message from Thorian. "I resigned," it said, "but I kept one thing." Then a second message came through, a photograph of his signed statement, time-stamped, notarized, and submitted to the state review. His final act. I replied simply, "Thank you." Evening settled over Cresthaven Vale, like ash finally cooling. Not gone, but quiet, and safe enough to breathe. I stood on the porch beside the hook, running my thumb over the small engraving Syrah had carved years ago. Her lines were steady, deliberate. She'd built this for a child who wasn't supposed to stand without fear. A child who now stood, not because she was forced to, but because she chose to. The sun slipped behind the ridge, leaving a soft glow on the brass. Evienne leaned against me, sketchbook on her lap, eyes following the last streak of light. "You think they'll stop?" she asked. I looked out across the neighborhood, now quiet in a way it hadn't been in months. "They'll learn," I said, "because we taught them." And for the first time since this started, I believed it. If you followed our story this far, and you believe homeowners shouldn't live under fear, that children deserve dignity, and that communities should protect, not punish, the vulnerable, subscribe right now and share where you're watching from. These stories matter, and yours might be next.